February 24, 2022, the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine to start the Russo-Ukrainian War of 2022. The main objective was the conquest of the capital Kyiv and overthrow of the Ukrainian government. Moscow expected the Ukrainian resistance to not last more than 3 days. But within a few weeks, Moscow was on the back foot owing to a series of missteps, miscalculations, and mismanagement of the invasion. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Russian ingress into the Ukrainian territory, the subsequent pushback, and the various missteps and blunders committed by the Russians that have led to a global embarrassment for Russia on the battlefront. The formal invasion of Ukraine started with the aerial bombardment to take out Ukraine's air defenses, communications, and radar installations. The aim was to destroy Ukraine's modest air defenses so the ground forces would not have any air cover. So more than 150 missiles thundered into Ukraine from bombers, submarines, and ships, and as many as 75 Russian aircraft streaked into Ukrainian skies to accomplish this objective. However, at the end of this exercise, most of Ukraine's air defense systems were still intact, and about 60% of Russian cruise missiles had missed their intended targets. Wait, how is that possible? Well, Ukraine knew that when it came to fighter jets, they were outnumbered 15-1. And also, the Russian planes were a lot more advanced with the ability to strike from greater distances. So Ukraine decided to decentralize its air defense systems. So it moved some of its air defense systems like the Buk and S-300 missile launchers, along with its primary radio intelligence command and control center, to new sites. The Russian missiles hit the old locations most of the time. Now, initially, the Russians did not have a clue that they had failed to cripple Ukraine's air defense systems. So their pilots kept flying as if they had, meaning their ground attack planes often flew sorties without any backup from other fighter jets. And this enabled the Ukrainian pilots to catch them off guard by flying at low altitudes, hidden from radar, and roaring up from behind to shoot them down. Finally, in March, when the Russian pilots realized their mistake and started flying low enough to duck under Ukrainian air defense radar, they fell into the sights of Ukrainian missiles now, including shoulder-fired Stinger missiles provided by the United States. And without proper air cover, the Russian ground forces became far more vulnerable. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, Russia's primary objective was the capture of Kyiv. And Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, is incidentally just 140 miles south of the border from Belarus. And Belarus was one of the key entry points for the Russian ground forces into Ukraine. Now, even though the Russian army had been amassed at the borders for months, the soldiers really did not know that one day they would be invading Ukraine. Most of them actually thought that the amassing at the border was just to display strength during the negotiations and nothing else. The first units that started moving into Ukraine got the order to go into war only an hour before they started the march. The order was both simple and wildly optimistic. Follow the vehicle in front of you and reach Kyiv within 18 hours. The vehicles were massive and heavy, So they started ripping up the roads they were driving on, and the convoy got bogged down as a result of this. It took them more than a day just to cross the border into Ukraine. So the convoys kept ambling along slowly, and without any protection or air cover, they became very enticing targets for the Ukrainian forces. And it was around the middle of March that we started seeing videos of burning tanks and abandoned vehicles hundreds of miles short of their intended destination. And the losses continued to mount. There was a giant armored column of more than 30,000 troops, which was pushing towards the city of Chernihiv, which is northeast of Kyiv and a lot closer to the border with Belarus. And this column of 30,000 Russian soldiers was annihilated by a motley group of Ukrainian defenders, outnumbered 5-1. How? Well, the Ukrainian soldiers were hiding in the forest and picked apart the Russian column with shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons like the American-made javelins. Now, many have blamed the initial setback on a very centralized and rigid Russian military organization, which took about 48 to 72 hours to even update its intelligence and then decide on changing course of action. But there was a bigger issue at play here. Russians, by amassing at the border for a long period of time, had given ample notice to the Ukrainians that they were intending to invade. And that gave ample time to the Ukrainians to prepare, update, move things around, and seek military help from NATO and other nations. And after all of this heads up, underestimating Ukraine's preparedness was the biggest blunder committed by the Russians. There was a third element that Washington was most concerned about, and it involved infiltration of Ukrainian networks by the Russian military. The Russian hacking unit known as Sandworm had waged attacks against the Ukrainian power grid starting in 2015. But it was labor intensive and only somewhat effective. So the United States, Britain, and other allies helped shore up Ukrainian computers to stave off Russian intrusion in anticipation. So on February 23rd, as expected, hours before the actual invasion began, Sandworm took another swing, launched malware that infected several hundred Ukrainian government computers, but the intrusion was detected quickly and the damage was contained. But Sandworm 2 had a backup plan which was bolder than its first attempt. It went after Ukrainian military satellite communications used by soldiers in the field. This time it worked, and by 6:15 a.m. on February the 24th, the system went down right at Ukraine's most vulnerable moment. But just as on other fronts, Ukraine had a backup plan. A separate satellite communications system, which it had tested only 2 months before to make sure it was ready in the event of a Russian invasion. So now, with the plans thwarted on all three fronts, Russian forces were suddenly confronted with the most basic of problems. They hadn't brought enough food, water, or other supplies for a prolonged campaign. The net result? Russian soldiers started looting grocery stores, hospitals, and homes. And the panic went to such an extent that some even resorted to self-sabotage. Self-sabotage meaning Russian military drivers started poking holes in their gas tanks, disabling their own vehicles to avoid going into battle. There was another interesting factor that came into play very early in the war. Ukrainian law enforcement officials noticed a spike in foreign cell phone numbers near the border in the forests between Ukraine and Belarus. Russian soldiers were using cell phones to call home, and suddenly they started popping up on Ukrainian networks. And Ukrainian officials who monitor the cell phone traffic during peacetime for criminal activity realized that they could see and hear the invaders approaching in real time. So teams of women were set up in small listening booths, and they passed details to Ukraine's armed forces to carry out ambushes and counterattacks. In one specific instance, it took 40 minutes from the time one video was uploaded to pinpoint the unit's location near the Hostomel airport northwest of Kyiv, and the Ukrainian military then hit them with 3 Tochka-U ballistic missiles. Wait, 40 minutes from the time a video was uploaded? Yes, the Russian soldiers were not just talking on cell phones, they were also uploading TikTok videos. The morale of the rank-and-file soldiers ended up being so low that Russia started moving its generals to the front lines to shore it up. The generals, too, made a huge blunder. They positioned themselves near antennas and communication arrays, and that made it very easy to find them. So all of a sudden, we started hearing news of Russian generals being killed on the battlefield. And it was finally at the end of March, almost a month into the war, when Kremlin realized that it could not seize or encircle Kyiv and achieve its maximalistic objective. So Russia announced that it would focus on seizing all of Donbass. Russian forces retreated from Kyiv, Chernihiv, and Sumy areas and were redeployed to Kharkiv and Donbass, that is essentially eastern Ukraine. This was a huge inflection point in the war because once Russian forces no longer threatened Kyiv and other cities in the north, Russia's bargaining position and ability to coerce Ukraine decreased substantially. Now, once the Russians retreated from northern Ukraine, about 20 to 40% of Russian soldiers refused to return to Ukraine. And combined with high levels of attrition, by September, Russian units barely had 20% of their expected manning levels in Kharkiv. And as the war progressed, the Russian front lines were often managed by volunteers, mobilized men, and even mercenaries and semi-private paramilitary groups like the Wagner Group. Russia, though, had the artillery advantage, and the Ukrainian soldiers who were holding the defensive lines were heavily outgunned. But they ensured that the Russian advance was slowed down, and this brought critical time as the Ukrainian troops were training on the increasingly sophisticated NATO artillery systems, specifically the High Mobility Artillery Rocket Systems, or the HIMARS. The arrival of HIMARS had an immediate effect on the battlefield. Russia's logistics system, that is fairly antiquated, still relied heavily on large ammunition depots. Ukrainians started using the HIMARS to target these depots, and the results were explosive. They also began to strike Russian command posts, and most likely were responsible for the strikes on the headquarters of Russia's 20th Motorized Rifle Division and the 106th Airborne Division in the month of July. And the main impact of the destruction of these depots was that the Russian artillery suddenly had a significant reduced number of rounds that it could fire every day. After causing significant damage to the Russian battle infrastructure, Ukraine planned a major offensive in Kharkiv. Russian forces did provide a warning about an imminent Ukrainian offensive, but the Russian military leadership appeared to have been against a retreat. But the fact remained that Russia on its own did not have much manpower or military equipment to halt the Ukrainian advance. So by middle of September 2022, once the Russian front lines had been penetrated, the Ukrainian forces recaptured 3,400 square miles in Kharkiv within 1 week. And the retreating army units had to leave their equipment behind because they didn't even have time to destroy it. And finally, after 2 months of fighting, in early November, the Russians withdrew from the right bank of the Dnieper River in the southern region of Kherson. So by middle of November, it was estimated that Ukraine had reclaimed 54% of the land that Russia had captured since the beginning of the war. So in its offensive, starting September of 2022, Ukraine was able to push Russia out of the northeast as well as some southern parts of the country. So what area of Ukraine is currently under the occupation of Russian forces? Total, it's about 18%, including Crimea, that it illegally annexed in 2014. So outside of Crimea, you can draw a thin curve along its eastern border through the provinces of Luhansk, Donetsk, and Melitopol. And the area under the curve approximately is under Russian occupation currently. So with the reversal on the eastern side of Ukraine as well, Russia now understands that defeating Ukraine through forces on ground is going to be extremely difficult. So it has now started launching attacks using Iranian-made drones. And the target of these drone attacks are cities and power stations across Ukraine. Drone strikes usually create more strain on the military, which has to track and intercept the drones. But Putin also hopes that besides increasing the strain on the Ukrainian military, they also create uncertainty and fear within the civilian population. And while Russia hopes to achieve this outcome, the losses on the Russian side continue to mount, including those from the New Year strike from Ukraine in the eastern Donetsk region on a couple of buildings that were housing Russian soldiers and military equipment. This time, even Russian lawmakers strongly criticized the military commanders for allowing troops to concentrate in an unprotected building within range of Ukrainian rockets and storing ammunition in the vicinity. Corruption and mismanagement have been the bane of Russian military for a long time now, and Putin is aware of that. But why did he still invade Ukraine? The only logical reasoning is that he got carried away with the success of the Crimean invasion that happened in 2014. But there was a big difference between the circumstances in 2014 in Ukraine and as they existed before the invasion. In 2014, the invasion was quick, it was confined to a small region, and most important of all, there was huge political turmoil in Ukraine. As I mentioned in episode 24, February 2014 was when Putin's favorite, Viktor Yanukovych, was removed from office following the Maidan protests in Ukraine. And immediately after that, Putin invaded Crimea. The big difference this time was that far from any political instability, the leader of Ukraine was Volodymyr Zelensky. And it is on that note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Which countries are members of the Five Eyes Alliance? The Five Eyes Alliance is an intelligence alliance composed of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States. These countries share a broad range of intelligence with one another in one of the world's most unified multilateral arrangements. So the answer is D, the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Question for the current episode. Among the former Soviet republics, which country has the highest GDP per capita? Is it A, Ukraine, B, Lithuania, C, Estonia, or D, Latvia? Once again, among the former Soviet republics, which country has the highest GDP per capita? A, Ukraine, B, Lithuania, C, Estonia, or D, Latvia? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in today's episode. In the next episode, we travel a little south and explore the sudden withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan, the build-up, the circumstances, and the mistakes made in the process. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.